Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. We have been discussing about several great women of India. In fact, this land has two major itihasas, and in both these itihasas, we do find many women characters who could be role models to all of us at different points of time. On one hand, we have the Ramayana, where we see Sita, Kausalya, Sumitra, Tara, and Mandodari. On the other, we have the great Mahabharata, where we are able to see Draupadi, Kunti, Gandhari, and so many other women. One question that lingers in many minds is that can we take all these women as our role models? My answer to this will be yes. We can take all these women as our role models. Probably not all of them at all points of time, but at some specific points of time and specific areas, maybe some of them will be better role models than the others. We need to understand that life situations vary from time to time, from person to person. So there could be situations which not all of us would face, but some of us would. And there could be similar situations, similar questions and answers in some situations given by our itihasas. If you try and look at it this way, we will understand Ramayana is generally a kind of a story where not many complications arise. But Mahabharata gives us situations where there had been lots of complications. Complications in the way people thought, complications in the way people handled, and complications in the way people behaved. And that is why it is a little difficult to understand some of the women we see in the Mahabharata. Let us try and look at these women and try to understand what they would want to convey to us. In the Mahabharata, the main women character we look at is Draupadi. If we can draw a comparison between Ramayana one side and the Mahabharata on the other, and if we take into consideration the two main women characters of both these itihasas, we can find a line of similarity. Sita was one who entered fire, and Draupadi is one who came out of fire. We all know Sita entered fire. There was the fire ordeal that she had to face at the end of the battle. Draupadi, on the other hand, was one who was born out of fire. Draupadi was so called because she was the daughter of Drupada. Drupada's daughter became Draupadi. But what was she called before people called her Drupada's daughter? She was christened Krishna. Krishna means dark. she was dark in her complexion and hence was christened Krishna. Anything that comes out of fire and cools will become dark, is it not? Even if the fire cools, it becomes dark. And so was this Krishna. It was a pure fate that she was born so. What exactly happened? Drupada and Drona, the great Dronacharya, were schoolmates, classmates. And because of a kind of a strange difference of opinion between the two, Drupada wanted to take vengeance on Dronacharya. And what was his way of vengeance? He thought he would have to have a daughter who would be able to marry Arjuna. Arjuna, the disciple of the great Dronacharya, and also a son who would be able to fight the same Dronacharya. To have his wish fulfilled, Drupada wanted to perform yajna, and most of us know what happened, like what many difficulties he had in getting the yajna performed. Somehow he got it performed. Let's not go into those details now. The sacrifice was performed, and out of the sacrificial fire came out this dazzling daughter who was subsequently named Krishna. What kind of a birth is that? Today, if we think of how Draupadi was born, is it not a little painful to think that she was made to be born because her father wanted to take vengeance on someone? His way of taking vengeance, because this disciple of Dronacharya humiliated me, I would have to take vengeance on him and let me have a daughter who would marry this man and subdue him. However, this girl was born. She grew up into a beautiful damsel. She was dark, but then extremely beautiful. And then came the time when the Swayamvara was to be performed. Drupada knew that it is possible in the Swayamvara that Arjuna would come and seek her hand. It so happened that at that point of time, the Pandavas did not want to reveal at the first instance that they were Pandavas. We all know Arjuna came there in guise and somehow won the Swayamvara and got the hand of this girl. So far, so good. Again, a very pure stroke of fate. Arjuna, who had won the hands of Draupadi, along with the other brothers, walked back home where the brothers and the mother were living in guise in the house of a Brahmin. They all went there, the brothers went there, and they announced from outside that they had brought a beautiful fruit. In Tamil, it goes like this. Amma kani kondu vandom. In Tamil, there are two words. Kani will mean fruit. Kanni will mean a virgin girl. Sometimes in poetic language, Kanni can become Kani. Whatever happened, we do not know. We only know that they went to the house in which they were staying, the brothers, and from outside they called out to the mother who was inside, Amma, we have brought this fruit. It is also customary. It is often found in literary tradition and custom that a girl, a beautiful girl, is referred to as a fruit. So they said, we have brought a fruit. And the mother from inside, the mother who had always wanted all her 5 sons to be together, the mother who had always shared all goodness to all her 5 sons, from inside commanded, if you have brought something good, all 5 of you share. That was the stroke of destiny that Draupadi had to face. Was she to be the wife of one single person who had won her hand, or was she to become the wives of all the 5? This was a question in front of her. She decided to accept the command. As the Mahabharata story unfolds, we find a sequence in it wherein Vedavyas comes in to meet the 5 brothers soon after this incident. Draupadi has come. Kunti has proclaimed that all 5 will have to share whatever they have brought. Draupadi accepts, and the story continues. Some days later, we find Vyasa himself arriving, trying to meet the Pandavas. After he meets with all the 5 of them, he wants to have a word with Draupadi also. So, Vyasa and Draupadi now, only the 2 of them. And then Vyasa kind of tells her, Amma, you have the liberty to decide. Do not think that you do not have the liberty, you have it. You may decide now if you want to accept the command of Kunti and be the Dharmapatni to all 5 of them, you can be. Or if you want to refuse, you may do so and be the Dharmapatni of Arjuna alone. The choice was in front of Draupadi. And Draupadi did not make an option. She was clear in her understanding. She was clear in her decision. She told Vyasa, I have just one choice. There is no question of either this or that. I have only one choice. I will go by the dharma that these 5 have been holding on together. At no point of time will I try to separate them. At no point of time will I do anything to separate them, but then go along with them to sustain Dharma. She made her choice, and that is when Vyasa came out with a practical solution, calling the rest of the brothers. He gave them the solution. Every year, she will be with one of them, and the other 4 will have to look at her as a mother and not as a wife. The strength of a woman who encountered a very strange situation and then went through the situation without any difficulty, overcame the difficulties of the situation unscathed. That is where we find the sublime purity and the serene majesticity of Draupadi. The story goes further. Draupadi had to suffer a lot. We all know what happened in the Rajasuya sacrifice. But then, very often, we tend to forget a very small praise showered by none else than Duryodhana himself on Draupadi, not where she was, but elsewhere. The Rajasuya sacrifice went on, and that is where the entire problem got precipitated. We all know Draupadi laughed at the way Duryodhana fell down, and then that instigated a kind of insecurity in the mind of Duryodhana. And then he wanted to take revenge on them, and all that continued. But you know what happened? Duryodhana, after his participation in the Rajasuya sacrifice, he went back. He went to his father. And to his father, he was narrating what all happened, in a way complaining that the Pandavas had so much of wealth and prosperity, in a way lamenting that however much we made them run away, they now have the support of so many people and so many things. But amidst all that cry and lament, you know what Duryodhana said? When I went there for the sacrifice, I saw everything. I also saw Draupadi. Draupadi was keen on feeding everyone. Whoever attended the sacrifice, she was feeding one and all. Not only the kings, not only the princes, not only the princesses, the queens, not only the upper strata, not only the elite, but then she was keen on feeding even the lowest of the low who was attending the sacrifice. And there I could see the compassion with which she was treating everyone the same. This, mind you, was not a statement from someone who respected Draupadi, but from someone who always wanted to challenge the authority of the Pandavas. It was Duryodhana who went and told about this quality of Draupadi to his father. She was so compassionate and would carry this compassion when she went to the forest. What ill fate can be more to any woman than to be made a kind of a coin in gambling? We know that too. When Yudhishthira had to participate in the game of dice, he was to keep Draupadi as a hostage. He was to keep Draupadi as a means of his wealth, his possession. Was she an object of possession? Was she a material of object? But then she was made a kind of a possession in that game of dice. When Yudhishthira lost her in the game, and when she had to undergo all that humiliation, she stood up and asked a question. asked a question in that assembly, that great assembly where Bhishma was there, Dronacharya was there, Kripacharya was there, where all elders were sitting. She asked the question if it was right for a man to pledge his wife. None of them had any answer. Even that grandsire Bhishma was silent. What ill fate for a woman who stood for compassion and dharma. She was humiliated in that grand assembly of Hastinapura. She was humiliated. My dear sisters, I do not think that any of us could even imagine the kind of humiliation that she would have suffered. We cannot even think of it today. But then she went through that. And after this, the Pandavas had to leave for the forest, and she decided to go along with them. The same Pandavas who had kind of pledged her in a game, she decided to go along with them. She decided to be their Dharmapatni forever. She continued into the forest as their Dharmapatni. And she would not leave any of her duties or responsibilities, even in the forest. She would always be compassionate and good to whomsoever who visited the Pandavas. We all know of another trick that Duryodhana played. Duryodhana was in his palace at a time when the Pandavas were in the forest. You know what he did? Sage Durvasa came to his palace. Duryodhana was careful. He knew if he would irritate Sage Durvasa, he would have to incur the wrath. So he was very careful. He gave all that the sage wanted, looked after very well. The sage blessed him and was about to leave, at which point of time Duryodhana showed his cunningness. He said, "What did I do? All this is nothing. My revered sage, all this is nothing. You must really go to my cousins who are in the forest. They would look you after much better. I would only request you to go there because you bless me now. I would want my cousins also to get these blessings." Durvasa, who was kind of lured by what Duryodhana spoke, decided to go in search of the Pandavas where they were in the forest. He did with all that paraphernalia of disciples. The sage went to where Yudhishthira was, and again Yudhishthira would have to look them after well. Yudhishthira went in to Draupadi and asked if food was available. That was the day when everybody had already eaten and Draupadi had almost washed the vessels. We all know that story. Durvasa went to have a bath in the river, and then Draupadi prayed to Krishna. Who else is there to help her except God? She prayed to Krishna, and then there was only one small bit of food left there in the vessel. She probably had not washed the vessel well, properly. There was one small bit of food left there, and Krishna saw to that vessel will not only be full, but then also saw to that the hunger of Durvasa was somehow taken away. Durvasa came back and said, Yudhishthira, I'm not hungry at all. My disciples are not hungry. So let's leave from here. And the problem got solved. But for a woman to be there in the forest, just imagine the kind of difficulty that came to her doorstep, and because of the grace of God, left. How many difficulties had she to face? Her difficulties did not stop there. After 12 years of exile, the Pandavas had to spend one more year in guise. Yudhishthira was really weather beaten. He was worried not about himself but about Draupadi. Primarily because the woman of the house will have to be looked after well, not only as a wife, but the husband also has an obligation to look after the wife as the mother of the household. So Yudhishthira was grief struck. He did not know. The rest of the brothers, the 5 brothers, can be in guise, but then what about this damsel? What about this grand lady? How can she be kept in some kind of guise? Draupadi came to his rescue. She said, do not worry. And she, on her own self, imposed the kind of guise that she would go through. She decided to be the servant, the maid in the house of Virata, in the palace of Virata. And there again, she suffered. That was where, in the Matsya country, in the Virata Parva of the Mahabharata, where they were living in the Matsya country, we find Kichaka, the brother-in-law of the king of the country, gave her trouble. Kichaka kept on abusing her in different ways, and she had to ask for the help of Bhima. She had to make Bhima come there and save her from the hands of Kichaka. A woman who was prepared to accept all the difficulties. A woman who was prepared to go through the difficulties. A woman who was prepared to subdue her own self, go into guise. When they were living in the Matsya country, she did not demand her level as the queen of a territory. She did not demand her level as the princess of a big country. She was an ordinary maid. She did not mind living the life of a maid. But even there, she would not be allowed to live the life of a maid. And she had to face the troubles of Kichaka. If you try and chronologically set the different episodes in the life of Draupadi, you will find that every point of time she had some hurdle or the other. As a child, she was born because the father wanted to have some kind of revenge on someone. And as she grew up, she was not very sure if Arjuna would come there to seek her hand. And then when she was really taken to the place where Arjuna lived, she had to kind of face a very, very strange situation of becoming the wife of 5 brothers who would not get separated. And then when she was in the garb of the Patni, the Dharma Patni of Yudhishthira, and in the garb of the great queen of that land, She had to kind of face a situation where she was mocked at by others. And then in the game of dice, she had to be brought down to the level from being a queen and a maharani to the level of being a coin, being a hostage. And in the forest, she had to face the score of difficulties, and ultimately in the Virata Parva, once again, she had to face the harassment. Just imagine the string of difficulties that this woman had to face. Amongst all these difficulties, she would still not leave her goodness. She would not leave her affinity to Dharma. She would not leave her compassion. She would not leave her magnanimity. And that was Draupadi. There again, things did not stop. Her difficulties continued. We all think of Draupadi as that woman who insisted on the war. Yes, she did. Krishna once asked her, not only her, but then Krishna had all the five brothers and Draupadi on the side. And before the war, Krishna would ask for the opinion from all the five brothers and Draupadi. The opinions from the brothers were kind of equivocal. Bhima and Arjuna wanted the war. Bhima wanted it because Draupadi wanted it. He said, please remember Krishna, the kind of humiliation that Draupadi suffered. And she has already vowed that those people who were responsible for that humiliation will have to be shown what they are. So we require the war. And Arjuna said, my weapons are all itching for the war. Fine, two of them said, war is required. And then on the other side, Yudhishthira said, no, Krishna, I'm not for the war. If you can still kind of make peace, it's fine. Nakula said, peace. Then Sahadeva was not definite. Sahadeva knew everything. He was a great jnani. So Sahadeva said, Krishna, I know pretty well whatever I tell you, you're going to have your own way. So you decide. Now, the tipping point was Draupadi. Draupadi said, I want the war. I would have to tell Duryodhana and his brothers as to what they did that day is wrong, is adharma. So she wanted the war. So we all think of Draupadi as that woman of anger, that woman of revenge, that she wanted the war. But then what happened after the war? If you can think of one person who suffered the most at the end of the Kurukshetra war, it can only be Draupadi. Leave the rest of them. Let's compare two women here. One woman who lost 100 sons in the war, and another woman who lost 5 sons. By now, all of us know who are the two. On one side, at the end of the war, Duryodhana and his brothers were dead. So, Gandhari, who lost all her 100 sons. Of course, one son was alive. That was a step-brother of Duryodhana. We'll not go into those details. We'll just say Gandhari, who lost many of her sons. On this side, we have Draupadi, who lost all her 5 sons. Draupadi had one son for every Pandava. That means there were 5 Upapandavas. 5 Upapandavas, each one being the son of each of the Pandavas. And they were Draupadi's sons. This side, one who lost many sons, and this side, one who lost all the 5. If you try and compare the number, it may appear that Gandhari was the greater loser. No, Gandhari knew her sons, at least most of them, were only practicing adharma. But then Draupadi's sons were all on the side of dharma. Someone who knew her sons were wrong. Gandhari knew her sons were wrong. She knew Duryodhana was wrong. She knew most of her sons were on the side of Duryodhana and they were all doing wrong things, including insulting God and women. But this side, Draupadi's sons were all on the side of Dharma. And how difficult it is to lose her sons, dharmic sons, and she did not have those sons at the end of the war. So her difficulties continued. On the day when Yudhishthira ascended the throne, and she was to sit beside Yudhishthira as the Maharani of that kingdom, how difficult it would have been for her to think that none of her sons were alive. Her sons were not alive to see her become the Maharani. Such was the fate of that great woman. If we try and consolidate the life of Draupadi, we see that from birth to death, she was to give others whatever she had. She was to kind of become a piece, an object of benefit for others. For her father, she was to fetch victory by subduing Arjuna. To the Pandavas, she became an object when she was played as a coin in that game of dice. And even in the war, she had to give her sons for the sake of sustaining Dharma. Draupadi was called Draupadi because she was the daughter of Drupada. She was called Panchali because she was the princess of the kingdom of Panchala. She was called Krishna because she was dark in color. But we find Draupadi, who was born out of fire. She had the qualities of fire. She stood as pure as fire would be. She gave purity to everyone else. If you put something in fire, fire does not get corrupted at all. It retains its own purity. At the same time, makes something that is put into itself pure. You put gold into fire, gold becomes more pure. Similarly was the level of Draupadi. And my dear sisters, let's also remember one thing. There is always a kind of a talk that Draupadi married 5 men. How could it be possible? Let us not evaluate Draupadi, or for that matter, any of those great women, by the yardstick that we have today. We have a very small yardstick. The idea behind Draupadi and the Pandavas can be thought in a slightly different way. You know what Draupadi means to this land. You know what Draupadi should mean to you and me. Draupadi is the mind. The five Pandavas, or the five senses that we have. Let's imagine a situation that you're seeing something in the television. You're viewing at something. It can be a match, it can be a movie, it can be something that you like. When you're glued, when your eyes are glued into the television set, your mind is there. At which time, even if the telephone rings, your ears are not able to hear. At which time, when you're really engrossed in something that goes on in the television, even someone comes and pats you, you do not listen, you do not heed. What does it mean? When one sense is completely engrossed with the mind, the other senses are not felt. You don't hear, you don't feel, you don't even know the taste. The same thing when the mind is in association with one sense. That is what Vyasa said. When Draupadi is living with one of the brothers, the other four will look at her as a mother. The other four will lose their functions in a way. Like how the mind merges with one sense, the rest of the four senses fade away. Draupadi is the mind. And let us look upon Draupadi as the one who stood for Dharma, so that all our minds are always pure and dharmic as that great lady was. Let us think of Draupadi for a while, and probably when we meet next, think of the other great women of Mahabharata.